I listened to you struggle. Frequently, you would try to describe what patriotism was, and then you would go back to 300 years ago, as if what you know about the redefinition of patriotism is recent or something. It's not.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
And what's on your mind today?
So let me ask you a question.
Uh-oh. I'm taking notes. Go ahead.
Tell me about your view of patriotism. Who is a patriot to you?
Who is a patriot to me? I look at patriotism as those thoughts, actions, people that support the democratic beliefs, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the independence of the American dream, going back to the 1700s and through the present. And so if I were to look at patriots, I would look at currently the military who is defending our beliefs locally and overseas. I would look at the representatives at a local, state, and national level who vow to support and defend the American Constitution. Those would be the global people that I look at from a patriotic standpoint. And if I go back and look at the history of America, I would probably go back and look at the Alexander Hamiltons and the George Washingtons and the Thomas Jeffersons. Now, they weren't perfect, but I believe what their efforts were in terms of believing and supporting in the America as an institution is what I would envision as patriotism.
So you bought the same propaganda that I bought.
Oh, well, that's good. Maybe because we probably had the same level of education, it just had a little bit different than in the South versus in the North.
I use the word propaganda because I am so disillusioned at the moment that I was sold a ton of goods that doesn't live up to the message, essentially. When I was a kid, I thought, and again, I'm looking at this through the lens of segregation and overt racism in Mississippi, et cetera. And believe it or not, I was thinking these things even as a preteen because it affected me then. But part of my reaction to not being accepted in the Southern culture was rationalization. And I rationalized that, and I believe that, I can't speak for every other minority, but I believe that many Black Americans felt that they had to prove that they were patriots. They weren't just Americans. They had to prove that they loved the country. In order to vote, we had to prove that we read the Declaration of Independence, or we knew some arcane aspect of the Constitution, which seemed to underscore the patriotic theme that we were taught. We had to prove that we were Americans. Even now, the discussion about the border and immigration has a central theme of being American rather than human rights. And we can be restrictive if we're being American, and we might be required to be compassionate if we think about the importance of human rights. There might be an argument of being supportive if people are running away from conditions that are denying humans of their inalienable rights. But I say I was rationalizing it because we were looking for ways to convince the majority to accept us. And there were distracting arguments as to why we weren't being accepted. And one of those themes was that we weren't patriotic enough, or we weren't real Americans. And we thought there was a way to prove it. You know, when I was 18 years old, one of those ways was go to Vietnam. A larger percentage of African Americans have served in the Army than any other culture, and yet we still aren't seen as Americans or as patriotic. And I'm not so sure that my belief of patriotism is wrong. But I am beginning to review my fanaticism about it because of the ease that some have seemingly dispelled theirs, or at least redefined what patriotism is. And then I realized it hasn't been redefined. Patriotism was convenient for a segment of our society. Patriotism was convenient for a segment whose primary concern is race. And they redefine patriotism every day in order to fit their world order from a racial lens. I guess I'm not feeling very proud of myself because it took me more than 60 years to figure it out.
You're not feeling very patriotic at the moment.
Oh, no, I feel very patriotic at the moment. I'm just disappointed and dismayed that I thought that was a unifying precept.
Well, I mean, if you look at the root of patriot, pater is father. And
I don't know
so
what that means.
the root, it basically came from the Greek of one's father. So a patriot basically is one of the country, being the father being the country.
Okay.
So a patriot is one who basically loves his or her father, or in this case, country, and will do anything to support and defend it. I think in many ways we have redefined patriot away from a global belief to a centric belief, sometimes political, sometimes self. And what I find distressing in many ways is your discussion, since you had to rationalize to not being accepted into the Southern culture, which essentially means not being patriotic meant that you didn't support or believe in the country, and you wouldn't defend the country and things of that nature. So interesting, that was your perception, and I have to believe that the white majority didn't help give you the belief that you were a patriot by isolating, by segregating, were putting you in a position that you were not, and continue to put you in a position that you are not part of this country. And I find it kind of distressing that this country that was built on openness and bringing people in seems to have developed a xenophobic approach, not just at the borders, but even within our own country. We have started to isolate groups of people, even within our own country, or continue to, I shouldn't say started, we continue to isolate groups of people even within our own country, and you are a patriot if you believe in the country, and if you don't believe in us, then you're not part of the country. And we have gotten so fractured that the term patriot, as it was originally envisioned 500 years ago, I'm not sure we have that same definition going on at the moment.
You seem to be struggling.
I am.
With the concepts.
I really have a difficult time with the way people argue patriotism in 2021, because it's much harder to find what I would have considered true patriots going back 300 years ago. So
I'm going to submit that the reason you're struggling is because we were taught patriotism was a pure religion. We were taught that patriotism had a uniform definition. And you keep going back 300 years ago, and I'm saying that that was false too, that even then, race was the issue. Now, there is a religion of patriotism that says this is what America should be. And we all know what that was. I mean, but at that time, tyranny and totalitarianism was a real threat. Our American forefathers, and I say our, even though they made me 3/5 of a person, their primary concern was the king. Their primary concern was how can somebody across the pond dictate what occurs in my life?
Right.
I should have more control of my life and liberty. And so I'm not saying that the concept of a inclusive democracy was not real. And I'm not dismissing the concept at all. What I'm saying is that it is not as important as race. And it is not the key to acceptance. For some reason, I had the misunderstanding that if I could prove that I was American, if I could prove that I valued the Constitution, if I could prove that I was human enough to be endowed with these unalienable rights, that I'd be accepted, despite my race, that patriotism unified us. Patriotism overcame everything else. When, in point of fact, when it comes down to race, exceptions are made. When it comes to race, patriotism is no longer part of the picture. And there have been numerous, I listened to you struggle. Frequently, you would try to describe what patriotism was, and then you would go back to 300 years ago, as if what you know about the redefinition of patriotism is recent or something. It's not. The 1776 a document was a product of a narrow argument, of a narrow myopic viewpoint. And even then, they were able to get race into it. And so you have to say that Hamilton and Jefferson were imperfect. Well, of course they were. Human beings are. But you had to say it because you understood that they also had some racist policies or viewpoints. At least the fact that Jefferson was a slave owner compromises the purity of his patriotism. The point is that it's nothing but a shield. Now, don't get me wrong. If America gets attacked, I'm going to defend it. But I think my greatest disappointment was we're living in times where people are, where everybody's trying to undermine I shouldn't say everybody, where the biggest threat to democracy is the attempt to undermine the integrity of our voting system. And they don't and the people who are doing this don't, it's such a power, the focus is actually on keeping power or grabbing or assuming power, to the point that they don't understand or we don't think they understand the permanent damage that they are causing to the faith that the American people have in that system.
If you will bear with me a second, if we go back to 1700s, the patriots were actually the ones fighting against the father country in terms of Great Britain. So the British actually used the terms for the patriots as the rebels who were rebelling against the monarchy. So it was embraced in the United States as the ones who took action against British control, etc. And in many cases, became a situation of a belief for support of the country and the freedoms of the country. And now we're using it in a more general fashion. So it was a group of rebels back in the 1700s, but now we want to group everybody as one who loves his country, his or her country, as the term patriot. And if you don't support the president, you're not a patriot. If you don't support the outcome of the discussions and I mean, we've got a splintering of patriotism, because I don't think we are finding a common belief any longer. It's become so splintered and so such a chasm, because what are we believing in anymore? And I there should not be race in patriotism when patriotism is a belief in the country, one who loves his or her country. There shouldn't be a race component to that. But somehow, some way, we have taken terms that were part of our basic tenets, part of our basic education, and rebranded them to mean a belief in an individual or a belief in a concept, but not a belief in the country any longer.
I find the point that you just made, very interesting, because that is exactly what the new patriots found. They're now fighting the father country.
Right.
And it's because of their view of race. They do not like where this country is headed because of the view of race. And so if you listen to their rhetoric, they are attacking things like being woke. They're attacking things like immigration. They're attacking things about inclusivity, white supremacy. They don't understand why that's an evil. They want to make it part of the pejorative conversation. They're tired of apologizing for venal thoughts and actions. And they want a new world order, or at least a new national order.
Do they want a new world order, or do they want to take the order back to 1776? And
okay, you're saying the same thing.
Okay, that's from a clarity standpoint. Their argument is correct me if I'm wrong. We should return to the way things were when we built the country.
Only from a racial perspective.
Okay, so they want to give you back to 3/5 of a person.
Right, right. And they don't want to acknowledge their hate.
Why is that patriotic?
Again, they're just rebelling against the present system. It's patriotic because they want the whole country to be this way. They are loyal to a certain type of country.
Well, if you think about it, you just said exactly what happened in 1776. They are fighting against, in this case, the current democratic approach to things, which might as well be King George in the UK or Great Britain in 1700. So they're fighting against a system that they don't believe in. That's how patriots were defined 300 years ago, 400 years ago. I think that we have a word that led us to success in the Revolutionary War that created heroes of many of the people that led us to the independence and the freedom and the country, the United States of America, that in 300 years later has a completely different meaning.
Well, I think patriotism has been romanticized to the degree that many people think. I love your connection to heroism.
Yeah.
Because I think many of the people who participated in the January 6th insurrection felt that they were being heroic.
Yes. And patriotic.
And patriotic. They had convinced themselves that this was the case, or they were convinced from their news feeds that they were writing some perception of wrongness. But it wasn't about government. The seeds of that insurrection was racist. And we can talk about that another day. The patriotic fervor related to government, as you said earlier, was actually a reflection of their faith in a person,
Right. An autocrat.
an autocrat, which is scary.
Yes. Well, that's
right. But they believe, but I believe that the solution that they want is to maintain white control, and numbers don't lie. Everybody understands that eventually there's going to be a plurality. And the only way to maintain white control is through autocracy. The only way the minority controls is through the filibuster. You have to tilt the table, which means you have to change the government. And there is no representative government that's going to maintain white control. Now, I happen to believe that a better outcome is a consensus of values that is good for the country, and that consensus of values is the basis, should be the basis for an inclusive government. And one of those values that I grew up with was the romanticized view of patriotism, of American patriotism. And I also believe that it still connects us. We just have gotten polarized at the communication. Did you see what happened in Nashville after a school board meeting, or just outside of Nashville?
Yeah, I heard about it. Help me clarify.
So they had a school board meeting, and apparently they had a few. They asked. They were discussing the whether they should have a mask mandate or not.
Mm-hmm.
And they brought some public health care workers to the meeting to answer questions. In the end, they voted for a mask mandate. After the meeting, apparently one of the public health care meeting workers was trying to drive away, and some of the parents that were in the audience surrounded his car and said, "You will never be allowed in public again. We know where you live." I mean, they're shouting at him, and he can't drive off. The police actually had to come and separate, and they're pointing fingers and telling them, they didn't have the courage to pull him out and beat him up then. It was clearly, they threatened him. If I was him, I would be capturing that footage and suing them.
What has happened to America?
I don't know, but that is, I mean, come on, really? Your child can't wear a mask, and I'm abridging their rights because I'm asking them to participate in a public health crisis by reducing the risk to themselves and others.
We used to be able to disagree without threats of harm.
I know. I agree. I know.
So I'm going to wrap this up with what has happened to America.
They definitely weren't having a courageous conversation.
No, it was a threat. It was definitely not a courageous conversation. And today was an interesting conversation. I was all over the place with today's conversation.
Yeah. I kind of caught you off guard.
Well, you did, and it was my brain went back to facts, and again, I hadn't looked at things in the same way. So it's always good to see things through your eyes.
No, it's not.
Well, it doesn't mean I agree. It doesn't mean I disagree. It's just
no, I agree. I thought it was a good give and take.
Yeah. Well, I'm learning.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.